Kalen DeBoer is going to win at Alabama. He's going to win quickly. He could even win national championships sooner than you think.
You are Locked On College Football, your daily podcast on all things college football. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, everybody, to the first episode of Locked On College Football. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view every day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. This is your number one source to stay up to date with the biggest stories for the greatest sport on planet Earth, that being college football. Like, comment, subscribe, rate, review. Please and thank you wherever you listen to or watch this show, which today is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. So, Alabama hires Kalen DeBoer, and this is a guy who is going to go to Alabama and win. Why am I so confident in saying that? This is a guy whose career has been one of absolute grinding, working at schools that are not big-time glorious places, that are not on the national map of college football, that aren't at the top of the minds of college football fans all across the country. And everywhere he goes, success has followed him on the football field. I have no reason to believe or think or even ponder the notion that him going to Alabama and getting the resources the Crimson Tide have available down there in Tuscaloosa is suddenly going to result in Alabama not winning as much, or Kalen DeBoer not winning as much. He can win national championships really quickly. He got Washington to a national championship game in year two. In Seattle. He took them to a place they had not been before. That's a program that has national championships back in the 20th century. But here in the 21st, Washington had not been to a national championship game. They'd been to a playoff once before. It's a place that when you have the right coach in place, you are going to be able to win at a high level. Chris Peterson demonstrated that. But DeBoer got there, and rather convincingly, I didn't think the game was as close as the score indicated, beat Texas in the college football playoff semifinal, a place that on paper should have more resources and star power than Washington, and Kalen DeBoer's Washington team was just better. So this is a guy whose career at an NAIA school at the time, the University of Sioux Falls, completed 5 seasons as the head coach. He won the national championship in 3 of them. It was so good there that the school felt it was time they go compete at a higher level. They're a Division II school. They made the jump after he departed. Well, that's a pretty good run of success right there. Then he ends up at Eastern Michigan, where he is the OC and quarterbacks coach. And a program that won 2 games when he first arrived was suddenly winning 7 by the time he left. Then he went to Fresno State and was the offensive coordinator, and for 2 years went 22-6. Then in 2019 at Indiana, the best run under the current coaching administration that they've had from a total win standpoint. They had a great winning percentage in the COVID year, but they had an 8-5 season when Kalen DeBoer was the offensive coordinator. Then he goes to be the head coach at Fresno State. They go 3-3 in the COVID season. They come out of it in 2021. They go 10-3. They very nearly beat Oregon at Autzen Stadium. They did beat a good UCLA team at the Rose Bowl, led by Chip Kelly and Dorian Thompson-Robinson, a team that had beaten LSU that year, a preseason top 25 team. And then he goes to Washington, and in 2 years, he's 25-3 as the head coach. He wins the Pac-12 this season. Before the national championship game against Michigan, he hadn't lost since the middle of last year. Now, interestingly enough, before Jim Harbaugh and the Michigan Wolverines, this just shows you the randomness of this wonderful, glorious sport that we have. Before Jim Harbaugh and the Michigan Wolverines beat Kalen DeBoer's Washington Huskies, the last head coach quarterback combo to beat them was, drumroll please, Sean Aguano and Trenton Bourguet, a running backs coach at Arizona State, currently under Kenny Dillingham down there in Tempe, and a former walk-on quarterback. Those were the last guys to beat him. They just went out and they won a lot of football games. And eventually they ran into a buzzsaw in Michigan that was an amazing team, as we all saw. Connor Stallions or no Connor Stallions, that's a really good football team. And Jim Harbaugh is a big-time coach. And the final score of that game was one in which you look at it and go, boy, 34-13, it wasn't close. They got blown out. Who felt that game was over going into the fourth quarter? I did not. Do not raise my hand for me, because that is not what that game was. Washington had a 37-yard completion called back because of a holding that was something that can be called. I don't know that it was always going to be called, but it was called in that moment. They were down 7 with the football in the fourth quarter. That is who this guy is. Everywhere he has gone, winning has followed. And this is a program at Alabama that we all know competes for national championships regularly. And for a guy who went and turned around a place in Washington that had a 4-8 season before he arrived, and it's not as if they had stockpiles and stockpiles of a bunch of great recruiting classes. They had some high-end talent that Kalen DeBoer got the most out of. They had high-end talent at arguably the most important positions. But DeBoer has just gone everywhere, maximized the talent that he's had, and just won football games. So if you give him Alabama's players, Alabama's recruiting potential, what is he going to do? He's going to win quickly, and he's going to compete for national championships. I think this is the sort of hire that Alabama makes because they feel he's not going to skip a beat. And I don't think he's going to. I don't know who's going to play quarterback next year. It could be Jalen Milroe. Will Rogers is in the portal. That's a guy who DeBoer wanted to bring to Washington before this offer came about. Maybe that's where they go. Maybe they go with a transfer. Maybe he just develops Jalen Milroe, because that's a guy who got significantly better over the course of this season and has a head coach coming in. If I were Jalen Milroe, I would consider this next piece of information. DeBoer's track record with quarterbacks is impeccable. You look at the numbers he put up with Michael Penix at Indiana. It was better than when DeBoer was not there as his offensive coordinator. You look at what Jake Haener did down at Fresno State. It was mighty darn impressive. They went into the Rose Bowl and beat that UCLA team on the road with less overall talent, mostly because their quarterback was very good. And then Michael Penix comes up to Washington. And I was someone who wasn't that high on him coming over from Indiana. I'd seen him play. He'd won some games, made a couple throws every now and then. Who had Heisman finalists and back-to-back seasons leading the country in passing on their bingo card for Penix once he got there? And Washington is a higher caliber program than Indiana, and they had better players and better receivers. So if you go down to Alabama and you have got the influx of talent every single year that Alabama is able to deliver, Kalen DeBoer has never been a huge recruiter. But one of the reasons that I think this is going to work is because Kalen DeBoer doesn't have to do all the legwork in recruiting the way he would up at Washington. You look at what a guy like Dan Lanning is doing at Oregon, and he is recruiting at a very high level. Very high level. High school, portal, it's all there right now. That's a guy who sinks his teeth in and recruits his rear end off. DeBoer has never been that sort of guy. And yet, Kalen DeBoer went 3-0 against Dan Lanning, all 3-point victories. You know that this guy knows how to coach. You know that this guy knows how to make the most of what he has. Well, if he's been maximizing rosters that are not as quote-unquote talented as some of the other ones in the country, what's he going to do once he's got a roster that is as talented or more talented than the ones that he's going up against on a week-to-week basis? This guy's got the coaching chops. Winning follows him everywhere he goes, and I expect this transition to be Alabama to be seamless, to be a home run hire, and for him to go down there and continue doing what he's always done as a coach, winning football games. Whether he's been a position coach, offensive coordinator, head coach, he's just won. I think he's going to keep doing it at Alabama. He's going to win quickly. And we should fully expect Alabama to be in the national title conversation year in and year out with Kalen DeBoer as the head coach. Kalen DeBoer is leaving Washington behind, but you should not leave behind the opportunity to go check out FanDuel, because that's America's #1 sports book. The NFL postseason is taking place perhaps as you listen to or watch this show. And if you want to spice it up, FanDuel is the best place to do just that. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's $150 in bonus bets whether you win or lose. You don't have to be right. You just have to place it. Just go out there and do it. The app is so easy to use. There are a bunch of different ways to bet, like live same game parlays. You can find bets in the new Explore tab. You can make a parlay in the Parlay Hub. The best way to find popular parlays, that and more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn. Make your first bet a layup. That's FanDuel.com/LockedOn to make that first bet as easy as possible. $5 down, win or lose, $150 in bonus bets. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. So Washington fans are not having a great time at the moment. And I'm a college football fan. I know what it's like to have a head coach depart. It's not a fun feeling. There's nothing enjoyable about it. There are very few silver linings to latch onto. Because any program, in Alabama, I don't think was an exception to this, and why I think DeBoer was such a good hire, you're one head coaching move away from changing the trajectory of your program to annual contender, either in your conference or nationally, to suddenly being middle of the road, bottom of the pack, irrelevant. It can happen. It has happened. Once upon a time, Nebraska was a big brand in college football. Once upon a time, Jimmy Johnson and Miami were the hottest commodity in this wonderful sport. Miami hasn't been that relevant nationally in, well, my entire lifetime. It just hasn't been the case. There are a number of other examples. So when you make a hire like Kalen DeBoer, he is being pulled away from Washington for a reason, and that reason is that he was very good. But now, Washington looking ahead to next year, it doesn't feel great right now if you're a Husky fan. At the moment, in this moment, before a head coach has been hired, there's nothing to latch on to. It's just complete unknown, uncertainty, going into the abyss. You have no idea what is going to happen. Once upon a time, Chris Peterson decided to hang it up, and there was a coaching decision that had to be made. And then athletic director Jen Cohen makes that decision and goes with the in-house candidate, Jimmy Lake. That, I won't take Washington fans down that particular trip on memory lane. It wasn't very good. It did not end well. And then they hired Kalen DeBoer. That went a little bit better. Now, the new athletic director, Troy Dannon, has a decision to make because there are going to be a lot of different candidates for this job. I don't think you describe Washington as one of the 10 best jobs in all of college football, but is it a good job? Well, if you're a really good coach, then yes, it is. Because we just saw Kalen DeBoer take Washington to the national championship game. But here's something I wonder. Is that as good as it gets? If you're a Washington fan listening to or watching the show, do you think that is as good as it gets? That is what peak Washington football looks like? If so, then you know what you're looking for. Someone who can play to the Chris Peterson or Kalen DeBoer sort of standard. But could Washington ever win a national championship? Yeah, I think so. They could have won that game against Michigan. I know that's not a very popular opinion because the Wolverines ended up winning by 21 points. But as I talked about earlier on the show, that was a game that was Washington 13, Michigan 20, Washington ball with a 37-yard completion. And then everything hinged on that holding penalty. That wasn't the entire game. Michigan was the better team. They deserved to win. I'm not taking that away from them at all. I am saying that the margin in that game from being competitive and a place where Washington could very well have won to a place where Michigan suddenly was in victory formation by the end of it, that was a very, very thin margin right there. But the interesting thing for Washington is that they have never been a premier recruiting school. It doesn't mean they haven't been a premier team in college football. That 2016 team with Jake Browning, who's apparently going to the NFL Hall of Fame with how he's been playing recently, that team was very, very good. This team with Michael Penix and company, yeah, it was very, very good. This is not a Washington roster, though, that has been stockpiled with big-time recruits. There are good players there. There are guys who could step in, but the difference in Washington's roster in 2024 compared to what it was in 2023 is going to be vast. It is going to be a huge drop-off pending who they hire, and that's what's so interesting here. Sometimes if you feel like you're just trying to, keep players around and just kind of continue things along, the in-house promotion feels like the right move. That's why they hired Jimmy Lake, because Jimmy Lake was a defensive coordinator. He'd recruited a lot of high caliber players and coached a lot of guys who are playing in the NFL. They're going to be playing on Wild Card Weekend across the league this weekend. So that was perhaps a logical move at the time. It did not end up working out. But here, this feels like a reset. This feels like a reset because Washington is losing Michael Penix, all three receivers to the NFL, both their tight ends, their running back, their two NFL caliber tackles, their two defensive ends, their middle linebacker, their safety, their number one corner. Do you see where this is going? This is going in a very, very tough direction. And so for Washington, they have to figure out when they're looking at this hire, do you think that this formula is as good as it gets, where Washington recruits as solidly, decently, but not as well as the product on the field always reflects? Do you think that that is the only formula, or do you want to find somebody who will change the recruiting base? Do you feel like Michigan just had better players and had a better roster? Michigan's composite rating on 24/7 Sports was not where it usually is for a national champion. It was still higher than Washington's. And so for the Huskies, that's the decision that this comes down to. If you feel like this was the best Washington could do, that it could never get better than that, then maybe you do look at Ryan Grubb, the offensive coordinator, and say, well, we just want to keep things going. We just want to keep things going. But if you decide to go in a different direction, and it's a new athletic director, so he's going to have a chance to make a hire that reflects his vision for what a successful football program looks like. So that's the question that I have, is what sort of coach do they hire? If you want a scheme guy, Ryan Grubb might be your dude. He's been the play caller these last 2 years. He's been really, really good. I mean, really, really good. And that could be an option. How much continuity would he be able to retain? Probably some. But there aren't that many players available who have eligibility that were impact players on this year's Washington team that would be back next year. So do you want to go find somebody who you feel like can change the talent base and change the recruiting base? I was doing some research because sometimes I decide to do that before I record a show. These are the recruiting classes that were built leading up to Washington's run this year to the national championship game with Kalen DeBoer. And a testament to what I was talking about earlier, that when you give him even more talent, I don't know how that results in less winning. So the 2020 recruiting class was the highest ranked one recently. That was the number 18 class in the country. There were some good players in there. The next class ranked 26th. The next class was 59th. This is overall 24/7 Sports composite talent, by the way. 59th in 2022. 59th. And 29th in 2023. Ordinarily, that would not result in a team going to a national championship game. But it did. So if you're Washington, do you feel like that's the only formula, that there's no way to recruit at a higher level, to have better players and combine that with great coaching and great scheme? Do you just have to have that magical season like they had this year that in many ways reflected what TCU did in 2022, though this Washington team, I think, was much better than that TCU team. If those two teams played on the field, give me the Huskies 7 days a week. Penix is better than Duggan. You got more receivers. There are a lot of NFL players on that Washington roster. But that's where the Huskies are at. They have to decide as they go into this coaching search, do we want somebody that is going to do more recruiting than what Kalen DeBoer did, or do we want to find someone who we think is like Kalen DeBoer in that he maximizes Jonathan Smith. He maximizes the talent he has. Wait, who said that? Who said that? I didn't. Somebody snuck into my office here and said Jonathan Smith. That's not going to happen, by the way. He's at Michigan State, of course. But is that what you're looking for? Because once upon a time, the great staff, or a great staff, there have been several, of course, that have done very well in Seattle, up there on Mott Lake. There was a staff once upon a time that had Chris Peterson, it had Jonathan Smith, and it had Justin Wilcox. Well, Chris Peterson was a great head coach. Jonathan Smith has been a great head coach, and I think will be again at Michigan State. And Justin Wilcox is currently a head coach down at the California Golden Bears. So but none of those guys, Peterson maybe a little bit more, but none of those guys, Peterson's classes were good, would be described as primary recruiters, as dominant as alpha recruiters, the way that you see some other coaches. So that's the decision that lies in front of Washington. There's also a decision that lies in front of them with regards to bringing a coach down from the NFL. I'm not that big on it. I am big on Game Time, though, because that's the fast and easy way to get tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater events near you. You shouldn't have to worry, folks, when you're buying tickets to your next big event. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their best price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. Game Time's the only ticketing app that gives you complete peace of mind with your purchase. You see the views from your seat before you arrive, so you know what to expect. They have all-in prices, so they're not giving you, fees and whatnot. You get it. You know you're getting a great deal up front before you check out, and you can buy tickets in just seconds with 2 taps. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. We're just flying through this first episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you have not already, please like and subscribe wherever you listen to or watch this show. So Jim Harbaugh has a decision ahead of him at Michigan. One in which I could readily put on my lawyer suit and make the argument for him to remain at Michigan or go to the NFL. I think going to the NFL has got a lot of appeal for Jim Harbaugh. And I just say this as somebody who has got an older brother. We were very competitive growing up in a number of areas, mostly, sports and video games and board games and all that sort of stuff. Do you think it eats away at him a little bit that his brother's got a Super Bowl and he doesn't? He could say publicly all he wants that it doesn't, but it's got to be there at least a little bit, right? Like it has to be a consideration. But I also think that Jim Harbaugh has an affinity for the NFL and can succeed in the NFL. And I think 60-40, I lean towards Harbaugh should go to the NFL and depart Michigan. Why? Because Jim Harbaugh has now accomplished everything you can accomplish at Michigan, other than winning another national championship. But you already are the hero of Michigan football. You're already the face of Michigan football. There's nothing else to accomplish along those particular lines. There are more championships to win, but you're the guy who brought Michigan back. You're the guy that's beaten Ryan Day and Ohio State 3 years in a row. You're the guy that climbed the mountaintop in a season in which it was labeled, you can agree with it or not, but it's how they viewed it up there in Ann Arbor. You can see it however you want, but they see it as us against the world. That's how they portrayed this season. So with that in mind, Jim Harbaugh could say, well, I have accomplished here what I set out to do. I've brought Michigan football back. I've made it a destination place. I built up the brand, and I won a national championship. We know the NFL back and forth has been going on for quite some time. But here's why going right now makes a lot of sense for Jim Harbaugh. Number one, there are attractive NFL jobs open. The Chargers is a good job. Being the head coach of the Los Angeles Chargers, they're the number 2 team in their own city. I'll grant you that. How many teams that are actively looking for head coaches that would consider hiring Jim Harbaugh can actually say, we have a franchise quarterback who's one of the 10 best at his position in all of football. We've got a roster that's loaded up with more talent than most teams that, didn't make the playoffs or even come close to doing it. And we just feel like we're a head coach away. To the Chicago Bears, that job's not coming open, apparently. I don't know why, but it isn't. If that job came open, do they feel like they're a head coach away? No. No, they do not. The Chargers feel like they're a head coach away from being a very, very good football team. Look at the Broncos with Sean Payton and the, shall we say, troubled relationship that he's got now with Russell Wilson. Does that feel like it was a head coach away when Nathaniel Hackett was there? No, it was clearly more than that. A head coach is going to help remedy the situation, but if you put the right head coach into the Los Angeles Chargers situation, like Jim Harbaugh, for instance, they could win right away. They could compete for the division. They could compete for Super Bowls very, very quickly, much like Kalen DeBoer will win quickly down in Tuscaloosa as Alabama's head coach. So I think that is part of the reason that it makes sense. And the other thing, too, is let's say that Jim Harbaugh goes to the NFL. and it doesn't work out. Let's say he goes and it's just a complete and total whiff. Do you think that the University of Michigan would ever not want to hire him again? Because it went pretty darn well this first time around. And I'm not really sure why, if they had a coaching vacancy or if they decided they wanted to move on from a current head coach, whoever that would be, who probably wouldn't have as much success as Jim Harbaugh has had because, well, no coach at Michigan has had as much success. Now, maybe they haven't made the right hires. Oftentimes, you can look back and say, yeah, they didn't make the right hires here and there. Well, if it's not Jim Harbaugh, so all you've proven is that Michigan hasn't been able to make the right hire consistently. Let's say he goes to the Chargers, and let's say for the first 3 years they make the playoffs, they're contending in the AFC. Let's say they make a Super Bowl. But then the last 2 years, it starts to flame out. It starts to stop working, and the Chargers decide we're going in a different direction. If in 5 years' time, the head coach at Michigan is churning out 8-4 and 7-5 and occasionally a 10-2 season, if Jim Harbaugh wanted to come back, don't you think he could? Because if I'm Michigan, I'd say, you come back anytime. We're going to be riding high off this national championship for a while. Come back anytime. And I think he'd go. And I think he'd do well. Because every time he's coached in college, he's won a lot of football games. His record at Stanford, really impressive. Really, really impressive. Record with Michigan, very good. Very good. He won a national championship. I think he'd be welcome back anytime he'd want. Speaking of NFL coaches, I've seen this notion get tossed around. Mike Vrabel was head coach of the Titans, didn't work out the last 2 years. I can't believe a team whose best quarterback for a few seasons has been Ryan Tannehill, followed by Malik Willis and Will Levis and something else they threw back there behind center. I can't believe that didn't work out and they didn't win at a high level. I think Mike Vrabel is a very good football coach. I think as it pertains to both him and Pete Carroll, I would be hesitant and cautious when deciding who my next head coach should be in college. Mike Vrabel was a position coach at Ohio State for 3 years. He spent a couple along the defensive line and one as the linebackers coach back in 2011. Then he got to the NFL and he became the head coach of the Titans, had a lot of success. It didn't work out the last couple of years. They've decided to make a change. And Pete Carroll, the Seahawks, since Russell Wilson was traded, has gone 9-8, 9-8, and an 0-1 record in the playoffs. They missed it this year because of an embarrassing home loss at home against the Steelers in the penultimate week of the regular season. So those two guys have both been floated around as potential college coaches. I would be very hesitant to hire either one of those guys. So Pete Carroll has got endless, relentless energy that we're all very well aware of. Pete Carroll has not recruited a high school football player since the mid-2000s. Okay, we're coming up on 2 decades now. Vrabel hasn't done it in over a decade. The only reason I don't completely reject this notion of making those two guys interesting targets to fill a head coaching vacancy should one come available at Washington, for instance, or at Michigan, for instance, if Harbaugh were to go to the NFL, is Jedd Fisch was hired kind of out of nowhere. I'll be honest, when he got hired at Arizona, I didn't know who he was, didn't know what he was doing. Guess what? He's a really good head coach and should be the top target for Washington as they attempt to fill their head coaching vacancy. So that's the one guy that I look at and go, well, it did work out really well there. It did go exceedingly well. It is going great down in Tucson. They're doing a lot of things well. So maybe from that angle, I'm not doubting that either of those guys can coach. I just don't know if either of those guys, Mike Vrabel or Pete Carroll, are the home run hires that programs are going to be looking for. I don't know if Pete Carroll is ready to come in and take over what looks like a rebuild at Washington, given the amount of talent departing the roster this year. I don't know if Mike Vrabel is ready to do that either for a guy who's never been a college head coach and hasn't recruited a high school football player in over 10 years. And Pete hasn't done it in over 20. It's a different world, and connecting with kids at that age, it's very different. So I'd be wary with those two guys. I just can't quite wrap my head around 72-year-old Pete Carroll. I mean, I know he's got a lot of energy. I know he's a legendary college football coach. I don't think this is a Saban returning to college or a Matt Rule returning to college situation. I think Pete Carroll is someone who is best served in what he's currently planning to do, and that's being an advisor to the Seahawks as they go get a new head coach. So I think it's curious, to say the least. We'll talk more about coaching searches because they are most interesting indeed. But that'll wrap up the very first episode of this new show. Appreciate everyone listening. I will see you next time. And until then, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.